War crime trials. After the war, the Allies faced the task of cleaning up the aftermath and punishing war criminals. This marked the first time leaders would be criminally charged for their actions during a conflict. Rules for international military tribunals had to be prepared especially for this trial, and it set a precedent for the many to follow soon after.
The location of the Nuremberg trials took place in the city of Nuremburg, Germany, which was chosen at the location for the trials. Once the site of huge Nazi Party rallies, it would now bring to justice the former leaders of that party. The seat of the International Military Tribunal was kept in Berlin to appease the Soviets.
The Palace of Justice was where the trials were held. It required extensive renovations to repair the building so the trial could be held. Luckily, this building was one of the few buildings to escape major damage in the Allied bombings of Nuremberg during the war.
United States Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson was chosen as the United States Chief Prosecutor in the trial. Roman Rudenko was the Chief Prosecutor for the Russians. Sir Hartley Shawcross was the British prosecutor.
The judges for the trial were Francis Biddle, former U.S. Attorney General and American Justice on the court, Henry de Vabres Donadieu, French Justice on the court, Sir Geoffrey Lawrence, British Justice and President of the court, and Ian Timovich Nitchenko was the Major General of Jurisprudence and Soviet Justice on the court.
The defendants all faced charges related to the atrocities committed by Nazi Germany during the war. 1. Conspiracy to commit crimes against peace. 2. Planning, initiating, and waging wars of aggression. 3. War crimes. 4. Crimes against humanity. Not all defendants were faced with all charges. The trial lasted 218 days and included testimony from 360 witnesses. Verdicts were announced on September 30th and October 1st, 1946. The executions were all carried out on October 16th, 1946, in the old gymnasium of the Nuremberg prison.
22 Nazi leaders were tried, including one, Martin Bormann, in absentia after not being found. He was later discovered to have died in 1945. These were all top-ranking Nazis, with trials of lower-ranked criminals occurring later, resulting in thousands of sentences being handed out. 12 of those tried at Nuremberg were given the sentence of death by hanging, including Martin Bormann.
Reich Marshal-in-Chief of the Air Force, Hermann Göring, was Hitler's heir apparent until days before the war's end, when he fell out of favor. He was sentenced to death by hanging, but committed suicide using a cyanide pill 3 hours before his sentence could be carried out.
Hans Frank was the governor and the general of occupied Poland. He was sentenced to death by hanging and executed on October 16, 1946.
Wilhelm Frick, Minister of the Interior, sentenced to death by hanging and executed on October 16, 1946.
Alfred Jodl, he was the chief of army operations, sentenced to death by hanging and executed on October 16, 1946. In 1953, a German appeals court found him not guilty of breaking international law.
Ernest Kaltenbrunner, chief of Reich Main Security Office, whose departments included the Gestapo and SS, sentenced to death by hanging and executed on October 16, 1946.
Wilhelm Keitel was the chief of staff of the High Command of the Armed Forces. He was sentenced to death by hanging and executed on October 16, 1946.
Alfred Rosenberg, minister of the occupied Eastern Territories, sentenced to death by hanging and executed on October 16, 1946.
Fritz Sackel was a labor leader, sentenced to death by hanging and executed on October 16, 1946.
Arthur Seyss-Incourt, Commissar of the Netherlands, sentenced to death by hanging and executed on October 16, 1946.
Julius Streicher was the editor of the newspaper Der Stürmer and director of the Central Committee for the Defense Against Jewish Atrocity and Boycott Propaganda. He was sentenced to death by hanging and executed on October 16, 1946.
Joachim von Ribbentrop, Minister of Foreign Affairs, sentenced to death by hanging and executed on October 16, 1946.
3 of the remaining 10 defendants were acquitted of all charges: Hans Fritsch, Hjalmar Schott, and Franz von Papen. Albert Speer, Baldur von Schurich, Konstantin von Neurath, and Karl Donitz were all given between 10 and 20-year prison sentences. Erich Raeder, Rudolf Hess, and Walther Funk were all given life sentences. Enrique and Walther were both released early. Rudolf died in prison.
Following the Nuremberg trial came many smaller trials of German and Japanese war criminals. Other war criminals who escaped were brought to justice through the efforts of Nazi hunters and Israel's Mossad.